The north is cold and full of whispers.
The man kneeling in the frost had a name. Ned knew it. He had asked for it, because a man deserved to be known before he died, deserved to have someone carry the weight of his name out of the world with some care. Will, a ranger of the Night's Watch, a man who had looked beyond the wall and seen something that broke him, and run south because running south was the only thing a broken man could think to do. Will's breath misted in the gray morning air. His hands were bound behind him. He was not weeping. He had moved past that somewhere on the road between the wall and here, some internal collapse that left a kind of stillness behind. His eyes were fixed on the trees, not the horizon, the trees. He was looking at something inside the Wolf's Wood's darkness that no one else could see. Ned did not need to ask what it was. He lifted ice. The Valyrian steel caught the flat winter light. Not a flash. Valyrian steel does not flash, it absorbs, redistributes, renders the cold in metal form. The blade was 6 inches wide at its broadest point, and Ned felt its weight the way he always felt it, as a question. The question being, are you certain? He was always certain, because he had trained himself to be. You did not pick up ice if you were not certain. You did not carry ice if you were not willing to use it. The man who passes the sentence, Ned said, should swing the sword. He had said this before. He would say it again. It was not a performance for the boys watching behind him. Robb standing straight, Jon standing straighter, both of them learning what Stark lordship required. It was a principle he had arrived at through experience and paid for with years of mornings like this one. Cold and gray and necessary, ice came down. Will did not cry out. That was the thing Ned always carried afterward, the specific silence at the moment of contact, the way the morning simply continued without the man who had been in it. A crow called somewhere in the Wolf's Wood, a horse stamped. The frost on the brown grass did not move. Ned's bannerman looked away, not from discomfort, from habit. This part was Stark business. Ned crouched. He drew the edge of ice across his left palm. Shallow, precise. The way a man opens a letter he has written to himself many times. The cut was small. The blood welled immediately, dark against the pale skin, darker than it should have been in the cold. He pressed his palm flat to the frozen earth between 2 stones. The earth took it. Not the way earth takes spilled blood, not passively, not with indifference. The earth drew it. He felt the pull, the deep-root claim, the acknowledgement that moved up through the frozen ground from something ancient and attentive below. Old gods doing what old gods did, watching, receiving, marking. He whispered 3 words in the old tongue, not the common tongue, not even the dialect the wildlings still spoke in the hills north of the wall. The deep form, the one the first men had used when they first pressed their hands to weirwood bark and made the compact with the children of the forest. 3 words that meant, I see you, we remember, the compact holds. He stood, he cleaned ice in the frost. He sheathed it. Robb was watching him with an expression that was trying to be unreadable. Jon's expression actually was unreadable, which meant something else entirely. Ride ahead, Ned said to his bannerman. We'll follow. He waited until the hooves faded down the frozen road. Then he looked at his sons. Sit down, he said. Both of you. There were no logs. They sat on the cold ground without complaint, because they were Starks and the ground was the north and the north did not apologize for being cold. Ned stood. He did not sit. This was not that kind of conversation. Your grandfather Rickard, he began, was a good man, a clever man. He watched the Targaryens hold 6 kingdoms together with dragon skulls and fire, and he decided the North would survive longer inside that structure than outside it. He sent Lyanna south. He planned to send your Uncle Brandon south. He was building something, a Stark dynasty that spoke the southern languages, married the southern houses, gave the southern lords no reason to fear the North. Robb said nothing. Jon said nothing. Eris burned him alive, Ned said. Inside his own armor, the metal heated until the flesh beneath cooked, and your grandfather screamed for a long time before he stopped. The Wolf's Wood was very quiet. His plan died with him. The Southron strategy, the honor, the reputation for being reliable, predictable, legible to people who think in terms of knights and faith in gold. All of it was Rickard's design, and it died in a throne room in King's Landing. A pause. What did not die was older than Rickard, older than Eddard Stark, older than the wall. He held up his left palm. The cut had already begun to close, faster than it should. The boys noticed. He waited until they had noticed. The kings of winter did not rule 8,000 years by being honorable, Ned said. They ruled because the land obeyed them. He did not lecture. A man of Ned's temperament did not lecture. He transferred information the way a maester hands over a document, precisely, without editorial, trusting the recipient to understand the weight of what they were holding. 3 abilities, he told them, in ascending cost. The first, warging, entering the minds of animals, the simplest, the most natural, the one every Stark since the first men had carried in the blood to some degree. The direwolves were not accidents. When the gift was strong in a child, the old gods sent the wolves to find them. This was how the compact worked. This was how it had always worked. Robb's jaw tightened. He was thinking of Grey Wind, of a dozen moments in the past year when the wolf had seemed to know things, had positioned himself in spaces that made no tactical sense until later, until the threat materialized and Grey Wind was already between Robb and it. Already there, already certain. Not accidents, Ned confirmed. Listen to him. The second, Greensight. The Weirwood network, every face-carved tree in the 7 kingdoms connected root to root, storing what they had witnessed for thousands of years. A Stark who could interface with the network could see the past. With enough skill, the present. Ned was careful here. He did not oversell what he could do. He described the edges of it honestly. Flashes, impressions, emotional residue rather than clear images. The difference between reading a letter someone had burned and reconstructing it from ash. The third he described briefly, the calling of winter, the pushing of cold through the land's own bones, through root systems and stone and the deep freeze below the frost line. He said, "This one is not for you yet." He said, "The price for this one I have not finished paying." He said nothing else about it. Then he looked at Jon. Jon's face was still. He had a face that had been practicing stillness for years. The face of a boy who learned early that showing what he felt created targets. Ned had watched him build that face from the outside and hated himself for it sometimes. "Ghost found you in the snow," Ned said. Separate from his brothers and sisters, white, like nothing that lives in the snow, is white, silent. He let that sit. That was not chance. The old gods do not work in chance. Jon said carefully, "What does it mean?" "It means the gift is strong in you, stronger possibly than in any Stark in a long time." Ned's voice did not change. "It means Ghost is not your pet, and he is not your companion. He is your other self, and you need to start treating what he knows as intelligence." Jon looked at Ghost. Ghost was sitting at the tree line, 15 feet away, watching the conversation with eyes the color of old blood. He had not moved once. He was still in the way that predators are still, not passively, but with focused attention, with the absolute patience of something that has already decided the outcome. "He already knows things," Jon said quietly. "Not a question." "Yes," Ned said. "He has been waiting for you to catch up." They rode south in silence. The wolfswood pressed close on both sides of the road. Ned rode slightly ahead, and the boys did not push for more, because they had been given enough, and Starks understood when a thing was finished. At a bend in the road, a weirwood sapling stood in the gap between 2 oaks, young and thin, barely a man's height. Its bark still pure white, the face carved into it recently enough that the edges hadn't softened with age. It watched the road with the attention all its kind shared, specific, patient. Without judgment, Ned pulled his horse up. He reached down from the saddle, arm extended, and pressed his still bleeding palm flat to the sapling's bark. The vision lasted 4 seconds. His eyes went white, not pale, not glassy. White, the color of something that had briefly ceased to be housed in the body behind it. His breathing stopped. The horse went still beneath him with the uncanny calm of an animal that understood it should not move. Then Ned snapped back. His eyes returned. He pulled his hand from the bark. He said nothing to the boys. His jaw was set. He looked at the road ahead, at the gray morning stretching south toward Winterfell, and something in the line of his shoulders had changed. Something that had been a plan had become a certainty, and something that had been a certainty had become a question. He rode on. The trees watched him go. King's Landing smelled of fish and smoke, and the particular human rot that gathers wherever too many people are pressed too close together for too long. Ned registered this through the horse's nostrils before he registered it through his own. He had been half inside the animal for the final hour of the procession, cataloging the city through its more honest senses. What the horse told him about King's Landing was that it was afraid of something it couldn't name, and had been for a long time. He surfaced, straightened in the saddle, put on the face. The face was Ned Stark of Winterfell, earnest, uncomfortable with ceremony, slightly bewildered by the heat, honest in the way that men who have never needed to be dishonest are honest. It was a face that Southerners found reassuring, a face that made men like Littlefinger lean back slightly in their chairs and allow themselves small, private smiles. Because a readable man is a manageable man, and a manageable man is a useful man, and a useful man is one you can keep alive until he isn't useful anymore. Ned had been wearing this face for 3 years. He wore it now, riding through the gates of King's Landing. Inside the face, nothing they could use. He found the God's Wood first. Not that evening. That evening was Robert's feast, and the feast required the face at its most sustained. Required Ned to sit at the high table while Cersei watched him from across the hall with eyes that were doing arithmetic, while Joffrey watched him with eyes that were doing something less organized and more dangerous, while Littlefinger watched from 3 seats down with the careful attention of a man memorizing a document he expects to need later. He found the God's Wood the next morning, before the household woke, before the servants finished with the fires. The Red Keep's God's Wood was small, a single weirwood at its center, old and worn, the carved face in its bark rubbed soft by centuries of weather and the hands of the desperate. It was not Winterfell's heart tree. That one was enormous and ancient, and spoke with the authority of something that had witnessed the age of heroes. This one was quieter, older in a different way. Older in the way of something that has watched much and said nothing and accumulated weight precisely through its silence. Ned knelt. He pressed both palms to the roots. The network opened, not with the crash of Winterfell's tree. This was gentler, filtered through distance, through the weirwood's age. What came first was not images. Emotional residue, the decades of feeling that had soaked into the bark. Desperation in layers, grief in layers, rage in layers. Men and women who had come here not because they believed in the old gods, but because they needed somewhere to speak without a septon listening. And the Sept of Baelor did not permit the raw kind of honesty, the kind that includes confessions you would not make to a man who reports to politics. Then, Cersei, not a vision, an impression. The specific quality of a mind that had knelt at these roots many times, that had spoken aloud here not prayers but negotiations, as though the old gods were another set of courtiers who might be persuaded to terms. Ned read the shape of what she had said here over years the way a man reads the impression left in a chair by someone who sat in it a long time. The weight of her fear, the precise direction of it. Not fear for herself, fear for her children, fear that had a name, and the name was Robert. He withdrew his hands, sat back on his heels. He knew more than he had before. Not enough. That afternoon he walked the battlements, a lord inspecting his new posting. A man learning the geography of a castle he would now administer. There was nothing unusual in that. The guards who passed him nodded. He nodded back. He found the raven in the 3rd tower, he checked. It sat in the eave shadows above the small council chamber, in a gap between 2 stones where the mortar had deteriorated. Young bird, not a maester's raven, feral, roosting where it chose, watching him with the flat attention of a creature that had never had reason to fear men specifically. He did not reach for it. He stood below it for 30 seconds, long enough to learn its smell, its weight in the world, the frequency of its small bird mind. That night he lay on his back in the chamber and stared at the ceiling, and went somewhere else. The raven's world was dark and enormous. Through the bird's hearing, which did not parse language the way a human mind parses language, but received sound as pattern, as shape, as emotional weather, Ned heard voices below. 2 of them. He let his mind do the translation, pulling meaning from shape. A voice like cut glass, every syllable placed with the precision of someone who had spent years ensuring only the words they intended carried weight. A voice that was tired in the way men are tired when they have been right about everything for too long, and being right has saved them from nothing. Fragments. The raven was not a positioned instrument. He heard, the children. He heard, he'll find nothing if he looks at the books. He heard, Stannis already knows. Then the door below closed. Ned stayed in the raven for another 30 seconds, confirming silence. Then he came back. Stannis already knows. He lay in the dark and understood that the geometry of his situation had just changed entirely. He had not come to King's Landing to discover a secret. He had come into a situation where several powerful people already held the same secret, were each waiting for the others to act first, calculating how to use what they knew without being destroyed by the using of it. He was not investigating a conspiracy. He was the newest piece inside one. He did not sleep. He worked. Over the next 12 hours he moved through 6 minds. A cat in the corridor outside Cersei's chambers. Cats moved through the Red Keep without challenge, treated as furniture by guards and servants both. and a cat sitting in a doorway for an hour is invisible in a way no human spy could manage. The hounds in the Tower of the Hand's lower corridors, through which every visitor to the Hand's chambers necessarily passed, and dogs did not read faces, they read something more honest than faces. The pigeons on the western ramparts above Littlefinger's window. The picture that assembled itself was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the satisfaction of revelation. It arrived the way intelligence always arrives. Piecemeal, partial, requiring inference to complete more alarming precisely because the inference required was so short. Joffrey was not Robert's son. This was confirmed now, not suspected. What surrounded the confirmation was the additional architecture. Varys knew. Littlefinger knew. Pycelle reported to Cersei, and Cersei knew that Varys was likely to know. Everyone was holding the same knife, carefully, waiting for someone else to cut themselves on it first. Robert did not know. The hand of the king, standing between the crown and the Lannister machinery that had quietly colonized half the Red Keep, was the only significant presence on the board who had not yet declared an intention. Ned sent 3 ravens north, 2 to Winterfell, 1 to the Wall. The messages were short, encoded in the old way, the system of word choice he and Catelyn had established years ago, in the quiet understanding that ravens could be intercepted by anyone with a maester who asked the right questions. He told Robb to count the garrison. He told Catelyn to close the roads south. He told Jon, watch the north, not the south. He went to the God's Wood at midnight. The Red Keep was quieter at this hour, but not quiet. A castle of this size never fully slept. Too many people in too many states of wakefulness and anxiety for silence to settle completely. The God's Wood was the closest thing to it. Torches at the entrance burned low. No guards inside. He pressed his bleeding palm to the heart tree's bark. He felt the network. The long roots running deep under the castle, under the city, under the harbor. And then north. North. Following the thread that connected Weirwood to Weirwood across hundreds of miles of continent, thinning through the crown lands and the riverlands where trees had been cut for centuries, thickening again north of the neck where the old ways had not been removed, because no one had ever thought it necessary to remove something that wasn't supposed to exist. Something was at the other end, something young. Open, curious in the way a child is curious, reaching towards sensation without understanding what it was reaching for. A mind like a hand pressed against the wrong side of a door, feeling the warmth of something through the wood without knowing what waited on the other side. Bran. Ned felt the boy's presence the way you feel someone standing behind you in the dark, not seeing them, knowing. The shape of that particular mind, the specific quality of that particular attention, equal parts hunger and wonder, unchanged since the boy learned to walk and began treating every high place in Winterfell as a personal challenge. His hand came off the bark, fast, clean. He withdrew entirely, pulling the thread closed behind him the way you close a shutter before the storm arrives. He stood in the God's Wood with blood on his palm, and the Red Keep pressing in on all sides, and the roots below connecting him to everything he was trying to protect. He did not reach back, not yet. Across the God's Wood's low wall, in a window above the small council tower entrance, a shape stood in the dark, not moving, watching the garden below with the patience of a man who had spent so many years observing people from elevated positions that he had stopped noticing the height. Varys let the curtain fall. He stood in the dark of his chamber for a long moment, aware of a pressure behind his sternum that he did not have a precise name for. Not fear. He was past the place in his life where fear was useful. Something more like the recalibration of a system that had just received data it did not previously have a category for. A man had stood in the God's Wood alone at midnight and wept no prayer and made no sound and pressed a bleeding hand to the bark of the heart tree, and every raven on the western tower had shifted simultaneously, turning, all of them as though toward a sound that had no sound. Varys poured himself water, not wine. He needed clarity. He went to his desk, opened the document that held his accounting of the new hand of the king, and drew a single line through 3 things he had written. He replaced them with 1 sentence. He stared at it for a long time. He sealed the document, put it in the drawer that no one else opened. Some information he had learned over many kings and many crises was not leverage. Some information was a warning. Ghost was not in the kennels. Jon had put him there himself. Not because the kennel master had asked. The kennel master had not asked. The kennel master had communicated his feelings about the direwolf through a series of silences of increasing duration, each one worse than the last, until Jon had moved Ghost there himself to forestall whatever conversation would have eventually followed the silences. He had left Ghost in the 3rd pen from the left, on fresh straw. With half a salted rabbit, he stood now at the empty pen, fresh straw, no rabbit, no wolf. He found Ghost sitting outside the kennel door, not pacing, not scratching at the wood, sitting straight-backed still, watching Jon walk toward him with red eyes that did not have the quality of an animal waiting to be let back in. They had the quality of an animal that had chosen to wait outside specifically because it had something to demonstrate. "You could have stayed," Jon said. Ghost looked at him. Jon opened the kennel door. Ghost did not go through it. He stood, turned, and walked toward the practice yard with the even pace of something that had already decided the morning's itinerary and was waiting for Jon to catch up. Jon followed. Because there was nothing else to do. Because he had been following Ghost's private itinerary for 3 months without fully admitting it to himself, and the kennel this morning was just the first time the wolf had made the arrangement explicit. The dreams had started in the 3rd week after his arrival at Castle Black. He had not identified them as dreams immediately. They had the texture of memories, cold and fast and smell first, the world organized around scent in a way that made color secondary and sound tertiary and everything else irrelevant. He dreamed of running through dark forest. He dreamed of the taste of rabbits still warm. He dreamed of the snow north of the wall and the specific quality of silence up there, which was not the silence of absence, but the silence of something large and attentive holding its breath. He woke from these, and his hands were cold. He woke once with his body arranged at the wrong angle, curled tight on the left side of the bunk with his knees drawn up, occupying a fraction of the space a person his size should occupy, because wolves sleep small and dense for warmth. Sam noticed the hands and asked about them. Jon said he ran cold. Sam accepted this because Sam accepted most things without requiring them to make complete sense, which was one of the things Jon valued about him. Gren noticed the wrong-angled sleeping once and said nothing, because Gren's relationship with things he didn't understand was to wait until they became things he understood and deal with them then. Jon noticed that Ghost, penned anywhere Jon put him, would be outside the pen by morning without having disturbed the latch. He noticed that Ghost positioned himself in locations that anticipated Jon's movements by several minutes. He noticed that when he rounded a corner, Ghost would already be sitting in the hallway beyond it, head turned toward Jon's approach. He told himself these were the behaviors of an unusually intelligent animal. He told himself that for approximately 3 months. The morning after the kennel, he went to the stables, not to ride. The stables were empty at this hour. The horses already distributed for the day's tasks. The grooms moved on to other work. He sat in the straw of an empty stall, and Ghost sat beside him, and Jon pressed his forehead to the wolf's. He let himself fall. It happened before he finished deciding to let it happen. One moment he was a 14-year-old boy sitting in cold straw. Then the translation. Instantaneous, disorienting, total, like stepping through a wall that turned out not to be solid. The world inverted, exploded, became too much, and then organized itself into too much that nonetheless made complete sense. Through Ghost's nose, the stables were a library. Every horse that had stood in every stall over 30 years of Castle Black's operation had left a record. Every man who had ever crossed this threshold had left a record. Jon, his own body 3 feet away, slumped slightly against the stall wall, smelled like cold stone and old leather, and something beneath that, something that the wolf had no word for but registered as pack, as home, as the most important scent in the range. He moved Ghost's body carefully, stood on 4 legs, and let the wolf's balance work through him. It was nothing like standing on 2 legs. It was lower and more distributed and more certain. The ground was immediate in a way it never was when accessed through the longer architecture of a human spine. He walked to the stable door, looked out at Castle Black in the morning. The crow on the armory roof turned its head toward him. He came back, sat up, blinked with his own eyes. The world was briefly too narrow, too high off the ground, too filtered. Ghost looked at him with an expression that managed, despite having a wolf's face, to communicate that it was about time. 3 days later he went further. He had been thinking about what his father had said. Ghost found you separate. Ghost found you white and silent. That means something. He had been thinking about it the way he thought about things that were uncomfortable to think about, methodically, in spare moments, turning it over to see if it changed. It changed. Every time he looked at it directly, it was slightly different, larger. He went out through the wall's northern gate alone. He told no one. He told the gate guard he was running the perimeter. Some rangers did this for fitness, for the particular discipline of running in cold that built a different lung capacity than training in warmth. The guard let him through without interest. He walked north until Castle Black was a shape behind him, And then he sat at the base of a black pine and closed his eyes and put himself in ghost. The wolf ran. Jon directed, loosely, carefully, the way you guide something that is already going in the right direction. He was not commanding. He was accompanying. Ghost knew this forest better than Jon knew any building he had ever lived in. They moved north together, and Jon catalogued what Ghost showed him. The forest was wrong. Not damaged, not burned, not cleared. Wrong in a way that took him several minutes to name because it worked by absence. No bird song. He had been in the Wolf's Wood at Winterfell, and the silence there was relative. There were birds, or there were no birds, and you noticed the difference, but the difference did not alarm you. This was not that. This was a silence that had weight. The small animals whose tracks crossed the snow were moving in circles in a small area, their trails layering over themselves repeatedly, because whatever was in the deeper forest had placed a ceiling on how far they were willing to range. Ghost slowed at a frozen stream. He went statue still, not prey still. That was a different quality, a coiling readiness. This was something else. This was the stillness of an animal that had encountered something its entire nervous system had no framework for. Ghost's instincts, which had a category for everything, predator and prey and rival and weather and human and the entire range of things the world contained, had no category for what stood between the trees 40 meters ahead. Jon saw it through the wolf's eyes and felt it through the wolf's nose simultaneously. It walked upright. It was pale in the way that nothing living is pale, the pale of things from which life has been removed rather than things that never had it. Its breath did not mist. Where it stepped, the frost on the bark of the surrounding trees spread visibly, creeping outward from each footfall in thin white fingers. The stream beneath the ice, which had been moving, Jon could tell from the sound Ghost's paws had made on it crossing, was silent now, had stopped. In 30 seconds of proximity it had stopped. The wolf's nose said nothing, no scent. The complete absence of the chemistry of life. It was like trying to smell a stone that had never been touched by anything living and never would be. Jon pulled Ghost back. Not running. Running would communicate location, and something in Jon was certain, through Ghost's certainty, that this creature registered fleeing prey. They moved south at an even pace, a pace that was nothing, a pace that said, "We were never here." Jon came back to his own body shaking. His hands were ice cold from the wrists to the fingertips. He tried again in a week. This time he took a raven from the wall's messenger stock. He brought it outside in the cold, held it in both hands until it stopped alarmed fidgeting and accepted his presence, and then slipped into it. A raven could cover in an hour what Ghost covered in a day. He flew north until the wall was a white line behind him, and the landscape below was black forest and gray sky and unbroken snow. He pushed toward the Fist of the First Men, following the thread of geographical memory from the accounts he had read in the Maester's library, and when he found it he understood immediately and completely that all the accounts were wrong. Not in the details, in the scale. The army of the dead was not a raiding force. It was not a scouting party. From Raven Height it had a geometry to it, patient, organized, positioned in the forest with the spacing of something that had been placed, rather than something that had wandered. They were waiting. They were arranged in the specific way of forces that knew where they were going and had decided not to arrive until the time they had selected. Jon came back to himself against the wall's southern face. He sat in the snow and breathed until the shaking subsided. Not yet. They were not moving yet, but they had selected a time. He wrote the letter in his bunk that night. He wrote it twice and burned both versions. The first was too long, the second was too much like a frightened boy asking to come home. The third version was 7 words. He folded it. He addressed it to the hand of the king, King's Landing, which was where his father was and which still felt impossible to say in his own mind without the sentence lurching. "Father, the cold has eyes. Come north." He sealed it. Ghost was lying across the foot of the bunk. He was not sleeping. He was watching the letter in Jon's hands with the red-eyed patience he brought to everything he watched. The patience of something that had already understood the ending and was waiting without urgency for Jon to catch up. Jon tied the letter to the next morning's raven himself. He watched it go south from the wall's eastern rampart until it was nothing but a black mark against gray sky, then gone. Ghost sat beside him and looked north. Jon looked north too. The darkness beyond the wall was complete and cold and very patient. He was beginning to understand patience. 2 days ago, a rat in Littlefinger's brothel had heard a voice. Not clearly. Rats process sound as threat mapping, not language, and Ned had needed to hold the translation loosely, pulling meaning from pattern the way you pull a word from a foreign tongue you learned badly in a cold room years ago. But the voice was Littlefinger's, and that was confirmation in itself. Littlefinger's voice had two registers. The performance register, which was warm and wry and constructed to communicate that its owner found the entire business of power slightly amusing. And the other one, the one without the performance, flat, precise, the register of a man issuing instructions he had already fully thought through. When the Stark is taken, not if, when Ned had spent those 2 days learning what it felt like to already know the thing you were pretending to discover, he catalogued the small performances required, the slight furrowing of brow at news that was not news, the questions asked at the right pace, the morning visits to the Tower of the Hand carried out with the purposeful stride of a man who believed his work still mattered. He had discovered, better at this than he had expected. Rickard's experiment in Southron assimilation had failed, but it had left its residue. 3 generations of Starks learning to be legible to people who thought in Southern terms had produced at least one Stark who could deploy illegibility deliberately. He kept the face on, he attended small council, he ate his meals at the correct hours, he spent the nights in 20 mines across King's Landing, mapping the deployment of gold cloaks with the patience of a man who understood that the precise shape of a trap tells you more about the trapper than any intelligence report. By the morning of the second day he knew 3 things. First, Littlefinger had spoken to Cersei. Second, the gold cloaks would move before the week was out. Their rotations had shifted in the specific way of men who had been told to be ready for a signal. Third, the number committed was larger than it needed to be to take one man. Littlefinger evidently had done some cataloging of his own. They came on the 4th morning. Ned was at his desk. He was reading a report, an actual report, a genuine one about grain stores in the Crown Lands, because maintaining the performance required that the performance be total, and a man preparing for a trap who stopped doing his work was a man who had signaled that he knew. He heard the boots on the staircase before they reached the landing, too many boots. Too even a tempo, men who had been told to come in formation. He put down the report, he folded his hands on the desk, he went somewhere else. His body sat still, his eyes opened into white, and stayed there. In the doorway of the Tower of the Hand, the first gold cloak stopped so abruptly that the man behind him walked into his back. The Lord Hand of the King was seated at his desk, with his hands folded and his eyes the color of old bone, and he was not moving, not breathing in any rhythm a man uses, not doing anything a man does. The gold cloak took 1 step into the room and stopped again. He had been told the hand would be taken. He had not been told about the eyes. Ned was not in the room. He was everywhere. The mastiffs in the Red Keep kennels went first. He was not gentle about it. There was no time for the careful approach he used in reconnaissance, the slow establishment of thread and presence. He pushed into them hard and fast, and the dogs felt it as command, as the arrival of something in the dominant position that all the training in the world had not prepared them for. They hit the ends of their chains simultaneously, all 6. The kennel master, who had worked these dogs for 11 years without a bite, lost 3 fingers in the first 4 seconds. The chains held for 7 more. In the courtyard below the Tower of the Hand, the gold cloak horses were next. Ned moved through them in fragments. Not full habitation, not the deep translation he used for extended work, but touches, flickers. Enough to introduce something that the horses registered as pack signal, as the smell of predator, as the ancient instruction carried in the prey animal's nervous system that has only ever meant one thing. The horses stopped obeying. Not in unison, individually, one then another, then 3 at once. Each animal making its own private decision that whatever the man on its back wanted was less important than moving away from the thing it felt in its chest. A horse carrying an armored gold cloak that decides independently to go a different direction is not a horse anymore. It is a problem. A 2,000-pound problem wearing a man like a hat. Ned catalogued it distantly. 12 horses, 7 riders down. 5 horses departing the courtyard through the main gate at a velocity that was nobody's decision. He pushed into a hound on the Street of Sisters and used it to redirect 3 gold cloaks who had been moving on the postern gate. He pushed into the Red Keep's oldest dog, a retired hunting animal who slept outside the steward's hall and had not bitten anything in 4 years, and used it as a relay point, a fixed node in the center of the courtyard's chaos, from which he could feel the movement of bodies as pressure against the air. The prose of it, from inside, was not dramatic. It was not triumphant. It was the feeling of too many nervous systems at once, each one carrying its own version of fear and pain and urgency, each one a small fire of sensation that Ned was feeding rather than experiencing. He was not afraid. He was too distributed for fear. He was also, and this was the thing he could not fully explain and did not try to, too aware of the cost already accumulating to spend attention on the satisfaction of it. 2 of the dogs were going to die. He could feel this the way you feel weather. Ahead of time. Certain. Jory Cassel had been fighting for 6 minutes. He was good. He had always been good. Not the kind of good that gets sung about. Not the Jaime Lannister kind of good. But the reliable workmanlike kind of good that kept men alive across a career of genuine violence rather than tourney ground performance. He had put down 4 gold cloaks. He had taken a cut across the forearm that he was not looking at, because looking at it would require thinking about it, and thinking about it would require slowing down. He came around the corner of the Tower of the Hand's ground floor entrance, and stopped. He had served House Stark for 19 years. He had ridden north of the Wall twice. He had stood in the same room as Tywin Lannister and not flinched, which was something of an achievement. He had watched Ned Stark do things in the line of duty that most men couldn't carry out, and Ned had carried them out with a steadiness that Jory had privately found both admirable and slightly terrifying. He was not prepared for this. His lord stood in the center of the courtyard, motionless, white-eyed, not white-eyed the way a man's eyes go when he takes a head wound, not glazed, not unseeing, white the way the face of a weirwood tree is white, the color of something that was not absent but elsewhere. The courtyard around him was absolute chaos, horses screaming, gold cloaks down, dogs moving in coordinated vectors that dogs did not use because dogs did not coordinate like this, like soldiers, like something with a command structure. And Ned Stark stood in the center of it like a stone in a river, without expression, without movement, bleeding from his nose in a thin line that he did not wipe away, because whatever was inside that body right now was not thinking about the blood. Jory moved. He moved toward his lord because moving toward his lord was the only option available. He put himself between Ned and the 1 gold cloak, who had kept his feet and his nerve, and was now raising a spear. The spear caught him under the left arm. Jory had time to feel the impact and register what it meant. He had time to finish the movement he had started, turning, putting his shoulder in front of the spear's angle, accepting it instead of Ned, and to grip the spear shaft before his grip failed. He had time to hear, somewhere inside the chaos, a sound like a man waking from a dream. He did not have much time beyond that. Ned's knees hit the stone. He came back in pieces, the way the mind reassembles after the shock of too many simultaneous losses, each dead mind leaving its particular shape of absence. 2 dogs gone, their deaths inside him like closed doors. He was aware of his body. The blood from his nose had reached his lip, the copper taste of it. His hands were shaking in the specific way of hands that had been routing too much signal. He was on one knee in a courtyard of downed men and fractious horses, and 3 gold cloaks who were still standing but were not in any operative sense certain about what to do next. He found ice, lifted it. The 3 gold cloaks looked at the sword and at the eyes above it, which had returned to gray but retained something, some quality that was not warmth, and made a collective decision that had nothing to do with their orders. They ran. Ned let them. He went to Jory, who was already past help, and took a moment he could not afford because some things required a moment regardless. Then he stood. He sent the ravens himself from the tower's upper chamber, his hands still unsteady, the letters short because there was no time for anything longer. Robb said 3 words. Move south, now. Cersei had been at the window for 11 minutes. She had watched it start, the moment the horses broke, which she had found confusing and had attributed to poor handling. She had watched it escalate. She had watched the man with the white eyes stand in the center of her city's courtyard, while the city's dogs moved around him like water around a fixed point, and she had understood, with the cold precision that was her most reliable faculty, that she was watching something she did not have a category for. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up in Casterly Rock alongside Jaime's absolute certainty and her father's absolute coldness, and had learned that most of what people called frightening was simply power they hadn't encountered before and didn't know how to hold yet. She had survived Eris, survived 12 years of smiling at men who would have used her and calling the smile warmth. The man with the white eyes was something older than what she had survived. She let the curtain fall. She turned from the window and looked at Joffrey, who had slept through the whole thing and was now standing in the doorway of the Solar in his nightclothes, asking what the noise had been. She looked at her son, at his face, which had Robert's jaw, and her eyes and something underneath both that was entirely his own and that she had never been able to fully account for. And she felt something move through her that she did not want to examine too closely. She wanted her father, not as an ally, not as the political instrument she had been deploying him as for 12 years, as a father, as the one person she had ever known who could stand in front of anything the world produced and make it feel like a problem with a solution. She sat down, she wrote the letter in her own hand, she sent it before she could revise it into something more controlled. She did not look out the window again. 3 weeks into the march and Robb had stopped needing the scouts. Not dismissed them, he was not that confident or that careless. He sent them out at the prescribed intervals, at the prescribed distances, on the prescribed routes, because the prescribed routes were what Great Jon Umber and Rose Bolton and the 30 years of combined military experience riding behind him expected to see. Scouts going out and scouts coming back, and the Lord of Winterfell receiving their reports with an appropriate gravity and adjusting his dispositions accordingly. What he did not tell them, the information arrived before they did. He had been trying to find words for what Grey Wind showed him. He had been trying for 3 weeks and the words were all wrong because they were built for a different kind of knowing. Grey Wind did not send images, he did not send language. He sent the shape of the world as a wolf understood it, pressure and scent and the particular quality of silence that meant something large was moving through it. Robb received this the way you receive heat from a fire, passively at first, then deliberately, then as fluently as he received anything. The Lannister cavalry on the King's Road north of River Run, he knew they were there 4 hours before his fastest rider returned to confirm it. He knew from the way Grey Wind stopped eating mid-meal at the edge of the camp, lifted his head northwest, and held it there. The wolf smelled something carried on air that had passed through many miles of forest, and still carried the layered stink of horses. Too many horses, too densely packed, moving too slowly for a courier column. He told his commanders he had dreamed it. Great Jon Umber's response had been a silence of 3 full seconds, which was, for the Great Jon, a profound act of restraint. Then, "You dreamed cavalry dispositions, my lord," not a question, not agreement. The specific vocal register of a man filing something in the category of things he was not ready to address yet. "I dream clearly," Robb said. "Move the 3rd column east." They moved the 3rd column east. The Lannister cavalry materialized on the road 4 hours later, found the Northerners already positioned to envelop them, and retreated south. The Great Jon said nothing. He moved his jaw like a man chewing something that hadn't finished becoming edible yet. The wolves came because Robb invited them. He could not command the Riverlands packs the way he could command Grey Wind. The bond with Grey Wind was blood deep, infant deep, old as his first breath, and the pack connection had built itself in the slow years since into something seamless. The wild wolves were different. They had their own leaders, their own territories, their own understanding of the Riverlands' geometry based on 10 generations of moving through it. He could not command them, but he could reach them. Grey Wind as the relay, Robb with his hands in the wolf's fur at night, slipping alongside the wolf's consciousness the way you walk beside someone rather than behind them, and from there, from the elevated position of a bonded wolf's understanding of the wild world, extending an invitation outward through the pack frequencies that ran through the dark forest. "Come, there is meat here. There is something worth running toward." Not language, older than language. The signal that one predator sends to another when prey is abundant, and the territory is shared, and the gathering serves everyone. The wild wolves of the Riverlands had been responding for 2 weeks. He couldn't see them. Most of the army couldn't see them. But Robb could feel them running parallel to the column in the dark, roughly 60 of them by the 3rd week, keeping their distance, maintaining their patterns, present and waiting in the way that things that live outside human time are able to wait with a patience no human soldier could sustain. Several of his men had asked to be moved away from the left flank. None of them could explain precisely why. The whispering wood at dusk had a specific quality of sound. Dense canopy, the year's last leaves still holding on, the light failing early in the heavy tree cover. The army moved into its positions in the gray hour before dark, and Robb rode the line and felt what his scouts were telling him, and what Grey Wind was telling him, and triangulated between the two. Jaime Lannister was inside the wood with his cavalry, moving to intercept what his scouts had told him was an isolated northern column. His scouts had been provided that information carefully, by Ned, through ravens, through the patient days of intelligence collection in King's Landing, a coordinated piece of misdirection that had placed the isolated northern column exactly where Robb needed Jaime to believe it was. The misdirection had taken 3 weeks to build. It was the most elegant thing Robb had ever been part of, and he had not designed any of it. He had only been trusted to execute it. He intended to be worthy of the trust. The infantry engaged first. Clean and hard, the northern foot was good, disciplined, and motivated in the specific way of men who had watched their lord's father be taken in the south, and were addressing that grievance personally. Jaime's foot met them, and the lines compressed, and the noise of it was the noise it always was. Metal and breath, and a register below speaking that humans make in extremity. The Lannister cavalry on both flanks prepared to move. This was doctrine. Infantry holds the center, cavalry envelops the flanks, the hammer meets the anvil, and the anvil breaks. They started to move. The wolves were already there. Robb heard it before he saw it. A sound from the tree line that was not a sound an army made, not a sound a wind made, the sound of something coordinated and biological and very close, doing something that 60 years of Lannister cavalry training had prepared these horses for in exactly the way that 60 years of cavalry training prepared a man to swim, which was to say, not at all. The horses stopped obeying. Not in formation, individually, horse by horse, each animal making its own private and absolute decision that the rider on its back was wrong about what they should be doing. A war horse could be trained past many things: fear of fire, fear of noise, fear of the press, and stink of battle. The training worked because the training was built on top of instinct, and the instinct could be managed. The instinct that responded to wolf proximity in the dark was not manageable. It was older than the horses. It was older than the idea of horses being ridden. It lived below every layer of training in the oldest part of a prey animal's nervous system, the part that existed before prey animals had learned to assess threats rationally, when the only correct response to wolf smell in close quarters was immediate and unambiguous. Move. Now. In any direction that is not here. The Lannister left flank disintegrated. Not through casualties, through motion. The horses went in directions their riders had not selected, carrying armored men through dense forest at speeds that the forest did not accommodate. Men fell, horses fell. The sounds coming from the Lannister left within 90 seconds of the wolves moving into range were not the sounds of a contained accident of large proportions. The right flank lasted 40 seconds longer, then the same. Jaime understood it in real time. Robb could tell this from the way the Lannister center changed. The subtle reorganization that only happens when the man commanding recognizes that his flanks are gone, and adjusts his intention rather than waiting for confirmation. Jaime Lannister was many things. Slow was not one of them. He dismounted. He advanced on foot toward Robb's banner with approximately 40 men who had followed him out of the saddle, 40 men who had watched their cavalry evaporate, and decided that if Jaime Lannister was walking forward, then walking forward was what they were doing. The decision said something about Jaime. It said something about the 40 men. It said almost nothing useful about their tactical situation. He fought extraordinarily well. Robb watched him from the ridge and catalogued it with the part of his mind that would always be more interested in how things worked than in the outcome of them. Jaime moved through the northern infantry like water finding the path of least resistance, not forcing, not absorbing, redirecting using the shapes his opponents made when they attacked him as the basis for the next position. He was better than anyone Robb had seen. He was better than he should have been. Grey wind cut across the last line of Robb's guards. Not attacking. Positioning. The wolf placed himself between Jaime and Robb's banner with the particular precision of an animal that had understood the geometry of the engagement, several moves ahead of everyone in it, and stood and looked at Jaime Lannister across 8 feet of blood-darkened grass. Jaime stopped. His sword was raised. His breathing was controlled in the way of men who have trained their bodies to stay functional, while the mind does the expensive work of real-time assessment. He looked at the wolf. The wolf looked back at him. The wolf's eyes were steady and yellow and did not contain the thing that makes a predator's gaze frightening, which is hunger. They contained something more complicated than hunger. They contained patience. And something... Robb saw this and would never be able to describe it without sounding like a man who had been too long in the field. Something that was almost recognition, as though the wolf had already read the outcome and was waiting, without urgency, for Jaime to arrive at the same conclusion. Jaime lowered his sword. The northern guard took him from behind. He did not resist. Robb sat in the dark an hour after the last of it. Grey Wind's head was in his lap, and his hands were in the wolf's fur, and the camp around him was doing the things camps did after engagements. Fire, food, the inventory of what had been spent, and he was not doing any of it. He was sitting in the grass with the specific quality of stillness that came after he had been inside Grey Wind for a long time. The world still had a slightly wolf-shaped quality. Sounds arrived in the wrong order. The dark was slightly less dark than it should have been. He felt something that wasn't pride and wasn't guilt and wasn't satisfaction. Something flatter and more permanent. A battle won so completely it had barely felt like a battle. Jaime Lannister, the best sword in Westeros by most serious accounting, sitting in a tent under guard, taken without a genuine contest. The Westerland's flank destroyed not by northern steel but by the oldest fear in the blood of every animal that had ever been prey. He knew he could do this. That was the thing sitting in his chest that he could not process cleanly. Not the winning, the knowing beforehand, the certainty that had preceded every engagement for 3 weeks, that had sat under his strategic decisions like a foundation he hadn't built and couldn't fully see. He knew, and the knowing worked, and men were alive on both sides who would not have been alive if he had fought this the normal way, which meant he knew what happened if he used this wrong. A voice at the entrance to the command position, one of his captains, young, reliable, slightly awed in the way men got when things went better than they had been trained to believe things went. "My lord, we won." Robb's hands moved in Grey Wind's fur. The wolf was warm and certain beneath them. He already knew they would. That was the thing that frightened him. He dreamed of flight every night and woke every morning on the wrong side of the bed. Not the wrong side, the wrong position. Drawn into the left corner of the mattress, knees pulled to his chest, body occupying a fraction of the space his frame required, as though whatever he had been while sleeping had different dimensions than what he was while awake. He noticed this the way he noticed most things since the fall. From a distance, with the particular patience of a boy whose body had taught him that most of the things he wanted were not available to him, and that the alternative to patience was something worse. The dreams themselves were not frightening. That was the thing he turned over each morning while the fire was being built, and the castle sounds came through the stone, not frightening in the way that the fall had been frightening, that one long sliding instant of understanding gravity. The dreams were enormous, too much to hold. He woke from them the way you surface from deep water, the world above the water briefly less real than the world below it. Light was wrong, sound was wrong. The ceiling of his chamber was too close, too flat, too permanent. He flew. He did not know what he flew as. He could not see himself in the dreams. Only through himself, through eyes that registered movement differently, that processed wind as information, that measured distance in the relationship between the thing below and the air carrying him above it. He flew north, always north, over Winterfell's towers and the forest beyond, and the white waste that went on until it stopped being white and became something else. Something he could not look at directly, even in the dream. He woke one morning with bark stains on his cheeks, white-red sap, dried, the specific color of weirwood bleeding. He touched it with 2 fingers and felt the dried flake of it, and had no memory of leaving his bed or crossing the yard to the god's wood, or pressing his face against anything. He did not tell Maester Luwin. He cleaned it himself with water from the basin, and lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought, "So it is happening to me too." Maester Luwin found it 3 days later. He was changing the dressings on Bran's legs. The routine had settled into something almost companionable, Luwin's careful hands and careful silence. Bran watching the window, when the maester went still for a moment at the sight of a second stain, older, on the back of Bran's left wrist. He did not say anything. He completed the dressing. He asked how Bran had slept. Bran said well. Luwin nodded once, the way he nodded when he was filing something in a place he would return to. That evening, from his window, Bran watched Luwin cross the yard to the library tower. He stayed there for 2 hours. He came back carrying nothing. His face, in the torchlight crossing the yard, had the specific quality of a man who had looked for an explanation and not found one. Bran said nothing the next morning, neither did Luwin. This was how they had learned to speak to each other since the fall. A great deal of careful silence, each of them aware that the other was carrying something they weren't ready to put into words yet. It worked well enough. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who respected the weight of what they were not saying. He went to the heart tree on impulse. He could not have explained why that morning rather than any other. He had passed the God's Wood every day for months, Hodor carrying him through the yard, the weirwood visible through the gate, its face looking out with the patience all its kind shared. He had looked at it. He had not gone in. That morning he asked Hodor to carry him through the gate. The God's Wood in early morning was gray and specific, frost on the roots, the heart tree's carved face worn with centuries of weather, the eyes deep and the mouth a straight line that was neither smile nor grief. Bran had been here his entire life. He had climbed this tree before the fall, had sat in its branches and looked out over Winterfell's rooftops, and felt the specific satisfaction of height. He could not do that now. He pressed both palms to the bark instead. The tree was warm, not stone warm, not wood warm, living warm, pulse warm, a warmth with a rhythm beneath it, slow and deep, operating at a frequency that had nothing to do with seasons. What came was not his father's voice. It was the shape of his father's mind, compressed, partial, filtered through hundreds of miles of root and stone, and the thin thread connecting this tree to the small heart tree in the Red Keep's Godswood, like hearing a voice through a door of uncertain thickness. Not the words, the register, the weight of what was being carried. Supply wagons, a golden sigil, cold, deliberate cold, applied to stone with intention, the impression of something that needed to be cut, not with steel but with information, cleanly and early. Bran sat back. He did not understand it. He remembered it completely, all of it, every fragment with the perfect retention that the dreams had given him, as though whatever had been opened in his mind when the fall closed everything else had turned out to be a different kind of capacity entirely. He told Osha. Osha listened. She was good at listening. She listened the way wildlings listened, without the southern habit of organizing what they heard into the categories they already understood. She looked at him for a long time when he finished. Then she told him to go to sleep. She did not sleep herself for 3 days. He knew because he could hear her moving in the corridor at the hours when the castle was still, her footsteps, the particular footsteps of someone pacing out a problem they couldn't sit still with. Over weeks the channel improved. He did not know how. He sat at the tree each morning, and the thread that connected him to his father became slightly less thin, slightly less filtered, in the way that a path through a field improves not because anyone builds it, but because the same feet use it enough times. He was not trained. He had no instruction. He had the specific advantage of being 8 years old and therefore entirely without the adult conviction that what was happening was impossible, which meant he wasted no effort resisting it. He simply sat and reached. The intelligence moved through, in images mostly, his father's mind thinking visually, spatially, the way a soldier thinks. A ford crossing at a specific river bend, the watercolor of the shallow run, the width of it at low water, the shelf of stone on the eastern bank that made it suitable for heavy wagons. Bran received it and could not have said in words how he knew what he was looking at. He simply knew. The way you know the faces of your family, not reasoned, not recalled, just known. He asked Osha to send a raven to Robb. He drew the map himself on a piece of the maester's parchment. The river bend, the shelf of stone, the road approached from the west. Osha looked at the drawing for a long time, and looked at him and sent the raven. Robb's forces arrived at the ford before the Lannister supply convoy. The convoy did not reach Casterly Rock. He did it 4 more times. The 5th time his father pushed harder. Something urgent in the signal, the kind of urgency that moves through stone walls and closed doors that cannot be contained by the medium carrying it. Bran reached back. He pushed further than he had before. Too far, too fast, too much. The network opened like a wound. Not the thin thread to his father. The entire thing, every weirwood tree in Westeros carrying its 8,000 years of witness, every carved face that had ever watched a birth or a battle or a man dying alone in the dark with no one to know it. It did not arrive in sequence. It arrived all at once, the way white light arrives when someone opens a shutter in a dark room. Not gradually, not mercifully. A man kneeling on a cold beach, a woman screaming in a tower, fire consuming something so large that the fire took minutes to reach its edges, ice moving through trees that had forgotten what it was to have leaves, a wolf, white, enormous, running faster than anything Bran had seen run in the waking world, running north towards something that was running south, and the distance between them closing at a rate that had a number attached to it, a number Bran could not hold. Something pale and tall and patient at the edge of a forest, standing between dead trees, and the forest around it had been dead for a very long time. A tower he recognized, though he had never seen it. A woman's face he recognized, though she died before his birth. His own face looking up from the base of a wall in Winterfell's yard, the face he had worn the last morning before everything changed, and above him a window, and in the window a shape, and the shape looking down at him not with the face of a stranger. He screamed. He did not hear himself do it. He was too far inside the network to hear anything that was happening to his body. The scream was Osha's evidence. She was in the kitchen yard when it reached her, 60 meters and 2 stone walls away, and she described it afterward not as a child's scream, but as something that had no category, something that Winterfell's walls had produced rather than the boy inside them. Every raven on the castle's towers took flight, all of them, simultaneously, a black eruption against the gray morning, spiraling up, circling once, dispersing in all directions as though assigned to separate destinations. Osha ran. She found him pressed into the roots of the heart tree, face against the bark, both arms wrapped around the base as though the tree was the only thing keeping him from falling into something that had no floor. His eyes were open and white and his breathing was barely there. She pulled him free with the specific difficulty of removing something the roots had partially accepted. She carried him inside herself. She bathed his face. She sat beside him and did not leave. He came back in pieces over 2 days. Colors first, then shapes, then the sound of the fire, then the cold of the room, then his own hands visible in front of him and recognizable as his hands. Luwin sat across the room making no sound, watching with the professional attention of a man who had set aside every explanation he arrived with. On the second day, near dark, Bran turned his head toward the window. He said in a voice that had been somewhere a voice should not go and had not fully returned from it, "I saw everything." A pause, a breath, everything. He slept. The fire burned low. Outside, in the godswood, the heart tree's face looked out over the empty yard with the patience it had always had. The patience of something that had witnessed 8,000 years of men failing to understand what they were part of, and was prepared to wait as long as it took for one of them to be ready. Luwin did not write his letter to the Citadel. He sat in the dark and thought about what he had read in 30 years of books, and what he had seen in the past 2 days, and the distance between those two things. He sat there for a long time. Then he put more wood on the fire, pulled his chair closer to Bran's bed, and began a different letter, one addressed to no institution, one addressed to a single man riding south through the riverlands with a wolf at his side. He wrote, "Something is waking in Winterfell. Come home if you can." He woke before dawn and read. This was not insomnia. It was not anxiety. It was a discipline he had maintained for 40 years of managing the most powerful house in Westeros. The conviction that a man who knew more at sunrise than his enemies knew at noon had already won the first engagement of the day before leaving his tent. He had built this habit in his 20s and had never once found a reason to abandon it. The reports arrived the night before. He read them before sleep to organize the picture. He read them again at dawn to see what the sleep had clarified. The candle burned. The camp was quiet outside. He read, "The scouts sent north on the Gold Road the previous afternoon had not returned." He read that line again. Then he set that report aside and read the others. Supply tallies, cavalry dispositions, the night watch rotation, a complaint from a cavalry captain about the behavior of his horses, a field surgeon's accounting of men treated for injuries that were not battle injuries, a preliminary count of the 22nd day's forage. He read all of it. He read it with the same meticulous attention he brought to every document, because the habit of attention was what separated useful information from noise. And the moment you started deciding in advance which documents mattered was the moment your picture began to fail. He came back to the scouts, 18 men, a full cavalry escort, not a scouting party, a scouting force, equipped for extended ranging, armed for contact. They had ridden north on the Gold Road at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, and they had sent no signal fire and no raven and no rider back, and they had not returned. They went north, Tywin thought, and did not come back. Did not come back, yet. Did not come back. He rose, dressed himself without calling his body servant, a preference, not an austerity, and began his morning. The council of war was called at the 2nd hour after dawn. His commanders arrived knowing something was wrong, because Tywin had called a council of war rather than the morning briefing, and the distinction between those two things was one his commanders understood viscerally, if not always consciously. The morning briefing was information moving downward. The council of war was a problem that required more than one mind. They arranged themselves. Kevin, as always, to his right. The cavalry captains in order of their seniority. The field commanders. The master of supply. Tywin laid out what he had. He did this the way he did everything, without preamble, without softening, in the specific sequence that presented the facts before the analysis and the analysis before the recommendation, because a man who reversed that order was a man who had already decided the conclusion and was selecting facts to support it, which was how armies lost wars they should have won. The scouts, 18 men, full cavalry escort, the Gold Road north, no return, no signal. The horses, 3 cavalry squadrons in the western section of camp whose mounts had refused to graze near the tree line for 11 days. Not spooked by specific stimulus, the behavior had no identifiable trigger. The animals had simply decided individually and then collectively that something in the direction of the western trees was not compatible with eating. The captains had tried moving the horses to a different picket line. The horses had moved their refusal with them. 3 cavalry squadrons now operating at approximately 60% functional capacity, because mounts that will not graze become mounts that will not perform. The supply convoy, 40 wagons, 200 soldiers, standard escort configuration, destroyed on the river road 18 days ago. 1 survivor. The survivor's account, given twice, cross-referenced by the field surgeon who had treated the man's injuries. Wolves. 3 men. The wolves moved in coordination he described as wrong, not pack behavior, not the disorganized opportunism of predators taking advantage of a weakened column. Wrong. Like something that had been arranged. He did not use the word arranged to his commanders. He noted it internally. The ravens. 4 ravens sent to the Hand's Tower in King's Landing over the past 3 weeks. Replies received. Replies that were on their surface entirely plausible. Cersei's information, Cersei's priorities, Cersei's voice. Accept. He would return to the accept. He was not ready to address the accept in council. He laid out the forage numbers. He laid out the patrol coverage. He laid out the strategic position as it currently stood, numerically superior, logistically sound, territorially holding, and then he said the sentence, "We do not know what we are fighting." The tent was quiet. Kevin looked at his hands. The cavalry captains looked at the map. The field commanders looked at Tywin with the expression of men who had been prepared for many things their commander might say, and had not prepared for this. He let the quiet sit. It was important for the quiet to sit, because men who filled silence prematurely filled it with the wrong things. The conventional response, he continued, to unconventional cavalry disruption is crossbowmen in the tree line. Post them, every cavalry patrol, double the escort, and include a crossbow unit on the flanks. Standard doctrine adapted to local conditions. They wrote, they nodded, the ravens. He paused. 1 precise pause. I want the maester to log every communication with King's Landing for the next 14 days. Date, hour, the name of every raven used. I want a physical description of each bird that carries a return reply. Compare them against our own stock. Kevin looked up. You believe the ravens are being intercepted. I believe the information I am receiving may not be the information I sent for, Tywin said. Whether that is interception or something else requires more data. He did not say, and I believe the something else is the thing I am not ready to name in council. He did not say that, but Kevin, who had known him for 57 years, heard it anyway, and the expression on Kevin's face was the expression of a man deciding not to ask the question he had just thought of. 3 letters, Tywin said, standing, to Cersei, to Pycelle, to Qyburn. Kevin's mouth moved. Qyburn's expertise is unusual, Tywin said, before Kevin could shape the objection into words. Unusual problems require unusual expertise. The man's ethics are not the current concern. He wrote the letters himself. His handwriting was small and even and unchanged from the handwriting of the man he had been at 30. He had always considered legibility in handwriting to be a form of respect for the reader's time. Cersei's letter asked for the current state of the Stark situation in King's Landing, the disposition of the gold cloaks, what Varys had communicated in the past month, and whether there had been anything unusual. He wrote the word unusual with full awareness that it was imprecise. He wrote it anyway. He wanted to see what Cersei's idea of unusual currently was. The Pycelle letter requested every account in the Citadel's records, copies forwarded south through the Grand Maester's archive of Northern magical tradition. Old texts, pre-Targaryen texts, the Kings of Winter material, whatever existed. The Qyburn letter was shortest. It said, I have a question requiring your particular knowledge. Come at your earliest possible movement. He sealed all 3. He did not write to any sept or any septon, and he did not kneel before any representation of any of the 7. He had not done so in a meaningful way in 30 years. The gods, in his experience, were excellent institutions for managing the behavior of people who needed to believe in something larger than themselves. He had always preferred to work with what he could verify. The reply from Cersei's direction arrived in 4 days. Faster than it should have. He noted that. He read it at his desk at the same hour he read everything, in the same canonical attention. On the surface, entirely plausible. Cersei's particular vocabulary, her rhythms, the way she moved between political intelligence and personal assessment in the same paragraph, the content Hold your position, we have leverage they don't know about. The Stark overextends. Let him. He read it again. The words were right. The structure was right. The information was plausible. Not verifiable from his current position, but plausible. He had no specific reason to question it, except, Cersei afraid, wrote with more compression. Her sentences shortened when she was under pressure, not from consideration, but from the way genuine urgency strips language down to its load-bearing elements. He had watched her do this since she was a girl composing letters from Casterly Rock that she thought her septa was reading. The fear made her economical. This letter was not economical. This letter was arranged. The paragraphs built in the way of someone who had time to construct them. Cersei right now should not have time. The events in King's Landing that his own intelligence had described, the incident in the courtyard, the Hand's escape, the state of the city, should have produced a woman writing with compression, with urgency, with the weight of someone managing an immediate crisis. This read like someone who had written it once and then written it again. He read it a third time. He put it down. He placed it precisely parallel to the edge of the desk. In 40 years of reading intelligence reports, in 40 years of building pictures from partial information and acting on those pictures before they were complete, he had learned to trust one specific signal above all others. Not the signal of missing information, not the signal of contradictory information. Those were manageable. He had protocols for those. The signal he trusted most was the one he was feeling now. The picture might be wrong, not incomplete, wrong, built on data that someone had touched before it reached him. An incomplete picture could be filled in. You sent more scouts, asked better questions, waited for the gaps to close. A wrong picture could not be filled in. A wrong picture had to be thrown away and begun again, which meant accepting that every decision built on it was potentially compromised, which meant the cost of beginning again was not just time, it was everything that had been done in the interim. He did not throw the picture away. He was Tywin Lannister. He did not make that kind of decision at a candle-lit desk at the first hour after midnight based on the cadence of a letter. He added it to the file, the carefully organized mental file, and he noted what it meant for the file's overall reliability, and he adjusted his confidence in the picture accordingly, from high to moderate. Without ceremony, without drama, he snuffed the candle, he lay down. He stared at the ceiling of his tent for a long time in the dark, and there was no one to see the ceiling and no one to see his face, and the thing moving through his chest that he would have called professional unease if he had been required to name it, moved through and settled and became part of the picture. He breathed. He did not sleep for a long time. The work took 3 weeks. Not fast, not dramatic. The cold moved through the root the way cold moves through anything, slowly working against the ambient temperature of the deep stone, accumulating in the hairline spaces where the rock had natural weaknesses. Ned and Bran working in concert across 400 miles of root network. Bran at Winterfell's heart tree pressing south, Ned at the small weirwood sapling at the edge of the western hills pressing into the thread from above. The connection between them was thin enough that communication was impossible. What moved through it was not language. It was intention, a father and son pushing the same direction without needing to discuss the direction. The cisterns were carved into the bedrock directly above the spring channels. That was the architecture. The springs fed upward into holding cisterns. The cisterns distributed through pipes to the levels above. It was elegant and ancient and entirely dependent on the integrity of the stone between the spring channels and the cistern walls. The stone cracked. Slowly at first, hairline fractures, the kind that a mason's inspection would have called insignificant. But water finds every fracture and exploits it, and cold finds every fracture that water has touched and widens it, and over 3 weeks the cistern walls developed the specific kind of failure that looks like nothing until the numbers stop adding up. A cistern that held 5,000 gallons held 4,000, then 3, then 2, and dropping. The garrison switched to rationing on the 22nd day. Ned knew the hour it happened. A dog in the lower levels had picked up the change in the water distribution patterns, the smell of controlled scarcity, the particular stress chemistry of men being told to drink less. Cersei sent for the garrison commander on the 28th day. Ned was not in the room. He was in a cat in the corridor outside it, which was close enough. He heard her voice through the door, not the words. The cat's hearing organized sound by proximity and volume rather than content, and he heard the quality of it. Flat. Decided. The voice of a woman who had completed her accounting before she opened the door. The gate opened at dawn. Ned was at the main approach with 50 men. None of them armed for assault, because assault was not what this was. He rode in alone. The garrison parted. They were not broken. They were still soldiers, still disciplined, still organized. They had simply been given an order by the woman who had the authority to give it. And they were following it with the professionalism of men who understood that following this particular order was not defeat but its own kind of discipline. The great hall was lit. Cersei was dressed as though for court. He had expected many things from her. He had built a model of this meeting across weeks of hearing her voice through animal ears, across months of reading the shape of her mind through the tree's residue. The model had been accurate in its structural elements. The composure, the beauty deployed as armor, the performance of a Lannister queen intact and presenting itself as unbroken. What he had not modeled, the eyes. Cersei's eyes were doing something that her face was not participating in. Something that was not fear exactly, because fear in Cersei Lannister presented as aggression, and there was no aggression here. Something more like the expression of a person who had spent weeks preparing for a fight, and had arrived to find a different conversation waiting. She looked at him the way people look at things they have misread. "Lord Stark," she said. Her voice was controlled even, carrying precisely the amount of warmth the hostess extends to a guest she did not invite. "You've come a long way to collect your prize." "I haven't come for a prize," Ned said. She waited. She was good at waiting. Better than he had expected from everything the tree had shown him of her impatience. She stood in the great hall of her family's seat of power, which was also now surrounded by his army, and she waited with the specific quality of patience that belongs to people who have decided that whatever comes next, they will meet it standing. "Sign a document," Ned said. "Take your children somewhere safe. Don't come back to King's Landing." The silence that followed was long enough for the torch nearest to her to gutter once in a draft from somewhere above. "That's all," she said. "Not a question, not belief. The sound of a mind encountering something that doesn't fit its architecture and trying to determine where to place it. That's all. You've destroyed my father's campaign. You've taken my family's seat. You've—" She stopped herself. She was not a woman who listed things she could not finish listing. "And all you want is a signature." "I want the document to go to the Iron Throne," Ned said, "to the faith, to every Lord Commander of every great house, the true parentage of your children, sealed and witnessed. The Lannister name continues, the succession does not." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He was very tired, and the tiredness was the kind that had been accumulating for a year and would not resolve with sleep, but he was not performing patience. The patience was real. He had carried worse things than this conversation for longer than this conversation required. "You could have had us killed," she said finally. "All of us. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen." Her voice didn't change. "It would have been cleaner." "Yes. Why not?" "Because they're children," Ned said. "And because it wouldn't stay clean." She looked at him again. Whatever she was looking for, she found enough of it to make a decision. She signed. Her hand was steady. Her signature was the signature of a woman who had signed hundreds of documents in her life and understood that a signature was just ink until the power behind it was either real or not. She pressed the seal. She set down the quill. She did not look at the document again. "Where?" she said quietly. "Would you suggest we go?" "Somewhere south of the Reach," Ned said. "Somewhere the faith has less reach than it will have once this is distributed. Somewhere your children can be educated and protected and grow into people who are not heirs to a claim." She nodded once, the nod of a woman filing information rather than agreeing with it. "Somewhere," she said, "I can raise them without looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life." "That's the idea," Ned said. She walked past him toward the hall's entrance, and her back was straight and her chin was level, and she did not look at the walls of Casterly Rock as she left them, which was the most revealing thing she did in the entire meeting. A woman who was returning would have looked. A woman who was not looking had already said goodbye before she walked through the door. He found the weirwood sapling at the edge of the western hills at dusk. One tree, thin as a young man's wrist, planted or grown or pressed through rock by some children's working 2,000 years ago into a crack in the hillside stone, surviving in a place that should not have supported it, on water that should not have reached it through bedrock, that should not have permitted roots. It was alive. He opened his palm. The cut was in the same place all the cuts were. The left palm, the heel of the hand, the specific location that the old ritual required and that he had therefore pressed into scar tissue across 17 years of lordship. He pressed it to the bark. The tree was dormant. Cool, not the living warmth of Winterfell's heart tree, or even the quiet warmth of the Red Keep's worn weirwood. This was something further gone than dormant, something on the edge of whatever came after dormant, sustained by the root connection to the wider network but barely, the way a fire is sustained by one log when all the rest have gone to ash. The blood hit the bark, one leaf, blood red, the specific red of weirwood leaves in deep autumn, appearing from a branch that had been bare. Appearing in seconds, which was not how leaves worked, which was not how any of this worked by any framework Maester Luwin would have recognized. But it was there, small, perfect, trembling in the evening wind off the western hills. His hand did not stop bleeding for 3 days. He stood at the sapling until the dark came fully down over the Westerlands, and the lights of Casterly Rock behind him were the lights of a place that had been something and was becoming something else. The way all things became something else, given enough time and enough pressure applied in the right direction. He was very tired. He was going home. He knew his father was coming 3 days before the ravens confirmed it. Ghost knew first. The wolf's attention had shifted south on the morning of the 3rd day before, pulling from the direction of the King's Road with the specific quality of focus he reserved for things that mattered rather than things that were merely interesting. Jon had learned to read the difference. He sent no riders. He told no one. He went about his work and he waited, and on the morning of the 3rd day he was standing at Castle Black's southern gate when the lone rider came up the road through the last of the autumn snow. Ned had sent his escort home at the final way castle. Jon had expected this, could not have explained how he expected it, but the expectation had been settled in him for days, as certain as weather. One man on one horse, carrying nothing that announced him, moving north through a morning that was iron-gray and still. He rode the way he always rode, economically, without performance, as though travel were simply a problem to be solved by the most efficient application of horse and direction. He dismounted at the gate. Jon looked at him, Ned looked at Jon. A year had happened to both of them, and it showed in the way a year of particular weight always shows. Not in damage exactly, but in the quality of the stillness each of them had developed to contain what they were carrying. Ned's hair had more gray in it than Jon remembered. Jon was taller than Ned remembered. Both of these facts were true simultaneously in the cold morning air between them. Jon put his hand on his father's forearm. The soldier's greeting. Ned gripped it. Then he pulled Jon in forehead to forehead, the way the old gods greeted the dead, the way the first men had greeted their returned across 8,000 years of hard winters. A greeting that said, "You went somewhere difficult, and you came back, and here is the proof that I am real, and so are you." They stepped back. They straightened. The moment closed. They walked the wall at dawn, not because the wall required walking. It required watching, guarding, maintaining, all of which was happening in other places by other men. They walked it because it was the right place for what they needed to say, the right scale, the ice changing color as the sun came up. Blue-white shifting to something almost orange at the eastern edge, the colors moving across a surface that was not quite flat, that had the texture of something built by cold over centuries rather than anything human hands had intended. The world below was enormous and white and very quiet. Westeros from this height looked like something that could be held. Ned spoke first. He told Jon everything. Not a summary, not the version a man tells when he is managing how he appears in the telling. The full accounting, the gods would at midnight, and what the tree had given him. Cersei's voice through a raven too far above to parse words clearly, and the single fragment that had reorganized everything. The dogs of King's Landing going wrong simultaneously. Jory's last morning. The forged letters sent to Tywin. Cersei's cadence approximated with the care of someone who had listened to her for a long time through animal ears. Bran at the heart tree, pressing south along the route network, an 8-year-old boy carrying intelligence that had destroyed a supply line and cracked a cistern wall, the leaf that had appeared on the dying weirwood sapling above the Westerlands hills, the hand that had not stopped bleeding for 3 days. He spoke without editing toward heroism, without self-pity. In the flat, carrying voice of a man who had been moving too fast for a year to examine what he was moving through, and was only now, at the wall's edge with the wind coming off the ice, permitting himself to lay it down and look at it clearly. Jon listened. He did not interrupt. He had been raised by this man, and he understood what it cost him to speak this much. Then Jon told Ned what was north, not the version he had written in letters, compressed for ravens, stripped to the load-bearing elements. The full version, ghosts first ranging and the stream where the frost spread outward from footsteps, and the wolf's nose saying nothing because there was nothing there to smell. The raven above the fist of the first men and the view from altitude, the army of the dead arranged in the forest with the geometry of something placed rather than something gathered, patient, waiting for the time it had selected, rather than moving at the urgency of any enemy Jon had ever read about in any account of any war. Mance's face when the vision came through the weirwood thread at the night fort, the way the king beyond the wall had sat down on the floor without choosing to, the families coming through the wall's tunnels at dawn, old women with everything they owned, children who had never stood under a ceiling that held, men who had killed Night's Watch Rangers crossing through the wall's shadow with their jaws set, because the alternative to crossing through it was becoming part of the army north of it, and the living understood this even when they could not see it directly. Ned listened without interruption. At the end he asked one question. How many? Jon looked north. The darkness beyond the wall's edge was absolute. The sun was on the south face now, the north face in its own perpetual shadow, the forest below invisible except as a shape of deeper darkness against the gray sky. Enough, Jon said, that every choice we make from here is about what we do with what we have. Ned nodded, not the nod of a man processing information, the nod of a man who had already accepted the answer and was ready to move to the next question. Jon asked about the Iron Throne. Not with urgency, with the exhaustion of a man who had been looking at the wall for a year and had lost his ability to treat furniture in a city 400 miles south as the primary concern of anyone with working eyes. Ned was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the southern side, Westeros rolling away from the wall's base, forests and roads and rivers, and the distant smudge of smoke that was the cluster of buildings around Castle Black's southern approach. All of it vast, all of it from this height, also very small. Someone will figure it out, he said. Jon looked at him. The lords have structures, Ned said. The faith has structures. Old systems, they outlive the Targaryens. They'll outlive this. A pause. There are 100 people qualified to work on that problem. Reasonable people, most of them, who understand what stability requires. He turned from the south and looked north. There are exactly 2 people who can hold this coordination together. They looked at each other. Jon said nothing. He did not need to. They mapped the assets, standing at the wall's edge in the growing cold of the morning, speaking in the shorthand of men who had been thinking about the same problem from different angles for a long time, and had arrived at most of the same conclusions independently. Robb's wolves, dispersed back north after the Westerlands campaign, the bond still alive and responsive. Jon had tested this, sending a thread of invitation south through Grey Wind's awareness 3 days ago. And the reply had come back inside an hour in the form of Ghost lifting his head and settling again with the satisfied quality of a relay confirmed. The wildlings, 100,000 people who knew the terrain north of the wall, with the intimacy of generations, who had no illusions about what lived up there. The Night's Watch, no longer hemorrhaging men to a war in the south, its numbers thin but its purpose suddenly undeniable to anyone paying attention. The Weirwood Network, Bran as the central node, Ned and Jon as the field operators at either end of the coordination, the most comprehensive northern intelligence system in 8,000 years. What they did not have, Ned named it without flinching. Dragons. Valyrian steel beyond the limited supply already accounted for, fire of any kind in quantities that matched the scale of what was coming. Jon said, Dragonglass. The mines at Dragonstone. Ned looked at him. Stannis has Dragonstone, Jon said. Stannis already knew about the incest before any of this started. He has no love for the Lannisters and no particular reason to fight us. And he's a man who responds to a military argument. A pause. Give him a reason. A real one. Ned considered it the way he considered everything, fully without the performance of deliberation, the decision forming behind his eyes at the pace it actually formed. Right to him, he said finally, I'll co-sign. Jon nodded. They stood for a moment in the silence of the decision. Then Ned said, Are you afraid? Jon did not hesitate, did not reach for the version of the answer that sounded like a soldier. I've been afraid since Ghost showed me the first one, he said. Standing in a frozen forest, not making a sound, and the wolf couldn't smell it, and I understood for the first time what that meant. He breathed. I've been afraid every day since. Ned looked at him steadily. Good, he said. Fear is what a man feels before he does what needs to be done. Jon stood on the wall at the last light. Ned had gone below to sleep, the first real sleep, Jon suspected, since the hand had stopped bleeding. Ghost was beside him, fur the color of new snow, grown now to a size that made the word wolf feel insufficient, red eyes looking north with a patience that had nothing of waiting in it. Not waiting. The howling started at the base of the wall, one pack, somewhere in the dark forest below, a long rising note that had no fear in it, only declaration. Then another pack, further west, then east, then south, coming up from the Wolf's Wood through the relay of pack to pack to pack, passing the signal north like something carried hand to hand across a distance too large for any one voice to cover alone. It built, pack to pack, south to north, until it reached the wall and rose. And the wall itself vibrated, not visibly, not structurally, but Jon felt it through his boots, through the stone, the resonance of 700 feet of ice receiving something that had been sent to it. He let himself go. Not far, not the raven's distance, not the full translation, just enough, just the edge of himself released outward into the thread that ran through the wall's ancient stone, the root-thin weirwood connection that connected this place to everything the old gods had ever witnessed and everything they were still watching. His eyes went pale, not the ice blue of the things north of the wall. Older than that, the color of the compact itself, the agreement made on the shores of the God's Eye when the first men and the children had stood on opposite sides of something that could have been war and had chosen something else. The color of a promise that had been kept for 8,000 years through every crisis, and every king and every generation that had forgotten it, and the generation that remembered again. The wolf packs answered the wall from every direction. Below, through the tunnel, the wildlings were awake. Jon could hear the camp sounds, the fires, the voices of people who had crossed through the thing they had been told their whole lives would kill them, and had come out the other side into cold and uncertainty and the strange mercy of still being alive. Mance's camp, his people. The living gathered behind the only thing in the world that had been built specifically to protect them. Jon looked north. The darkness was absolute and patient and enormous. It was moving. It had been moving for months, 3 miles in 7 days, south and south and south. And it would keep moving because it had been arranged to keep moving, and the arrangement had been made by something that did not get tired and did not doubt and did not stop. He was afraid. He breathed the freezing air. He felt ghost against his leg, solid, certain, warm with the specific warmth of something alive. He felt the walls stone through his boots. He felt the root thread connecting him southward to Winterfell where Bran slept, and northward to nothing yet, the connection running out at the tree line and stopping where the weirwood stopped. He was afraid. He was the right person to be here. Both things. Fully true. Holding them both at once was what the wall required, and he was learning, one cold morning at a time, that this was what it meant to be ready. The north is cold and full of whispers. The north is ready. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.